Hi everyone, it's V and welcome back to Critical Healing Moment, a channel where we talk about social work, but more broadly, healing, social justice, and building a new liberated world and society. In today's video, I want to go over a few frameworks with you if you've been feeling overwhelmed by the current social, political, and climate environment. I wasn't planning on making a video about this, but the idea came to me as I was working through some of my own feelings, reflections, and actions that I've been taking over the past few weeks. I made a short clip on Instagram stories about this, but I definitely wanted to make a more in-depth video for you all. So these frameworks are not necessarily professional advice or evidence-based practices, although some of the elements of this framework are present in approaches such as acceptance commitment therapy, as well as in the practice of engaged Buddhism. This is just a framework that generally maps out my personal experiences and how I cope with existential dread and overwhelm. With that being said, I do have to say this is not professional medical advice. I am not giving you a medical treatment right now. This is purely for educational purposes. I am someone who believes that we all have the tools of healing inside of us, but we may need some support and direction in how to tap into them. Okay, so let's get started. We are in wildly unprecedented times, so it's normal if you're feeling overwhelmed right now. Let's first acknowledge that what we may be going through is trauma. So let me first quickly define trauma. I am planning on making a whole video on trauma and healing, but I will give you the short version today. Trauma is a state of overwhelm that exhausts you of your normal coping mechanisms. Trauma is this feeling of unbearable stress, and trauma is also subjective to each individual and how they experience and make meaning of the traumatic event. What is actually happening neurologically is that your brain thinks that you're in danger even if you physically are not. And this is why things like flashbacks and stuff like that are present in diagnoses such as post-traumatic stress disorder. When we are traumatized or experience fear, we tend to go into three responses: fight, flight, and freeze. I think most people are quite familiar with these concepts. They are instinctual to humans and all animals, and I remember learning about them in my high school biology class. It's easy to imagine these responses in a situation such as encountering a bear in the woods. However, it may be more challenging to understand these responses when the traumatic event is not a singular event, but is actually something that happens in the background of your everyday life. Naming these responses, fight, flight, and freeze, is not about judging them as good or bad, but it is about reflecting on how they may be useful or effective in each individual situation. I'm going to talk about flight first because that is the trauma response that I usually gravitate towards. Flight can mean avoiding the topic or situation. So in the context of sort of the political, social environment, I knew that bad things were happening, but I chose to avoid reading the news. I didn't want to click on any articles, I didn't want to learn about the details, and I avoided the reality of things by getting really into personal projects. Flight, like I mentioned, is a response that I gravitate towards. It's something that I noticed I did as a child and also in my adulthood. But flight can also keep you safe. Flight or avoidance can keep me from spiraling into a topic in an unhealthy way. Next up is fight. This may show up as acting aggressive or angry. Maybe someone who is in the fight response in this social political environment is leaving hate comments on public news articles, or they may be getting into arguments with people in their personal lives, like over chores or needing space at home. Where the fight response shows up doesn't have to be directed towards the source of the trauma. And I will say fighting in this example can also mean organizing or attending a protest. Lastly is freeze. Freeze as a response to our current social political climate, I would say, is resigning to the situation. It's believing that nothing can be done to change it. If you find yourself in one of these modes of responses and it's not serving you, what can you do to change how you approach it? So basically, the question is, how can we change our behavior if it's not serving us? So I have laid out 3 easy steps. I mean, easy, but also they require a lot of self-work, so I wouldn't say they're that easy. Step 1 is acknowledge how you are feeling and what trauma response you are in through mindfulness. It's so important that we take a pause and assess where we are and how we're feeling. I will offer a couple ways on how to do this if mindfulness is not something that you regularly practice. Yes, you can do it through things like meditation or reflection, but you can also do it in other ways. You could take a silent or quiet walk or run. You could talk to someone that you trust about some of your thoughts. You can journal about them. And something that I do that sometimes gets me into trouble is use my social media as a journal. I like to make social media posts that sort of capture what I'm thinking about. What I like about this is that, yes, it does get me into arguments sometimes. However, it is a way for me to connect with other people who may be feeling similarly. Of course, mindfulness is a practice that you can do just for yourself. However, I believe in the healing power of relationships, and so I encourage you to bring in at least one person into your process of acknowledging and naming how you feel. Step 2 is identify and return to your values. Your values are like a compass. They are the ideas and beliefs that guide the direction of your life. You might be someone who has explicit values. You might be someone like me who writes down your values in a bullet journal or a vision board, or maybe you have some affirmative quotes that you return to. But even if you don't do that, you do still have a set of values that guide your life. You just have to take some time to name and identify them. If you're not someone who usually writes them down, it might be helpful to write them down or say them out loud or share them with a friend. Step 3 is align your action with your values. So at this point in the process, you may realize that you are experiencing cognitive dissonance. Basically, what this means is that what you're doing in your trauma response is not matching up with one of your stated values. For example, if you value safety, but you tend towards a fight response and it gets you in trouble, it puts you and other people at danger, that is a form of cognitive dissonance. Once you have identified what is important to you, consider what options there are for next steps. For example, what can you do to increase safety if safety is one of your values? Another example is if you value caring for other people, but you find yourself resigning and giving up to the situation, what are some small acts of caring for people that you can take on in your life? It's important to examine your course of action through what you have control over and what you have capacity to do. Make this a commitment to yourself. Lastly, I very much encourage you to connect with at least one person or a group of people about your course of action. Community will be able to keep you accountable to your actions as well as support you in carrying them through. Maybe your action is to learn about a particular thing that you don't have much knowledge about, and so someone's assistance may be able to help you develop that skill. Here is a very simple but real example in my life. In my movement community/political home, we have a peer support system called CarePods. Shout out to my pod. The 2 other people in my pod and we verbalized our value of taking care of our body, but also our struggle in being able to be accountable to ourselves and like exercise and do all that stuff, right? So that is the cognitive dissonance. So we were able to connect over this and create a plan on what to do next. So the day that this video is supposed to come out, in the morning is supposed to be our first scheduled morning stretch time, which we plan on doing at least twice a week together over video call. When we were, putting together this sort of idea, We didn't actually use an explicit framework like the one I'm laying out. So what I'm doing is I'm reverse engineering what I have done in my life to kind of create the steps for this framework. But like I mentioned, elements of this framework are present in evidence-based practices and spiritual practices, but I believe that this process is universally useful for the human healing experience. No matter if you receive it through self-help, community care, therapy, or spirituality. I will put some links in the description below if you're interested in learning more about some of these concepts. I'm also putting up a self-reflection guide on my Instagram that is based on the outline of this video if you want a visual reference to these 3 steps. Make sure you check it out. My Instagram is linked below in the description box. Thanks for watching this video, and if you've made it this far, I'd love to know what are some of your favorite mindfulness practices and what are some values that are important to your life? Leave them in the comments. I hope this video is helpful for some of you, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!